Hi everyone, welcome to week 7, our final week of the course. I'm really looking forward to reading your visual responses that are due tonight at 11:55 p.m. So be sure to get those in the Dropbox that's on Moodle in week 7. This week we're going to be discussing emergent curriculum. What are some of the tensions in emergent curriculum in early childhood education? And what is emergent curriculum in response to in terms of the colonial legacies of education that we're reading through Marie Baptiste this week? So to begin, let's revisit the question again, what is pedagogy? So Erica Berman offers a notion of the pedagogical state that we read about, I think, in week 2, which helps us to kind of attend to the schooling of a citizen, of subjectivities, both within and outside of schools, and how these new forms of active citizenship are mitigated through pedagogy. So pedagogy invites critique and develops capacities to act in the worlds in which we live. So in this sense, it can be argued that pedagogy is viewed from Berman, this is a quote from Berman, as a distinctive modality of power which has consequences for the terms of critique on which critical scholars of education and schooling rely. So Silvana Calaprice is a professor of curriculum studies and pedagogy in Vienna, and I think that her work can help us to think more critically about what pedagogy actually is. And that's a good place to start thinking about what emergent curriculum is. She says that pedagogy is in that space or gap between theory and practice, curriculum and subject formation. Pedagogy is informed by the theoretical orientation that you use to understand the world. It's how you understand things through the particular theoretical lens that you're viewing them from. So pedagogy is a type of knowledge. It's a mode of thinking that's interested in educating toward particular subjective formations. So it's interested in producing some kind of human. And this is fundamentally different than psychology and developmental theory. If we're thinking pedagogy, we're thinking of the space between the human and the world. Not only about the human or the construction of the self, we're situating our thinking in between these two things and composing this between space in ways which creates conditions for new trajectories and other possibilities of who the human might become in relation to the world, not only who the human is or who the human can be defined as. So as we discussed last week, a pedagogical project is not about implementation or an application of a model because it's always in response to the world in movement. It's also not interested in fixing individual behavior or languages of intervention or influence. It's more about composing relations. So in this way, we see the child as what Biesta has called a subject of action and responsibility, not only agentic and not only receiving education, but a subject who's forming and formed by, a subject that's to and of, a co-maker of knowledge and worlds. So in this post-structural orientation to pedagogy, the image of the child is porous, permeable, and co-constitutive of the worlds in which this child lives, as we've discussed in week 4. So in a post-structural orientation to pedagogy and within an emergent curriculum, educators and children encounter the worlds in which they live, and educators make pedagogical judgments about what is educationally desirable within a particular place and time. So educators see pedagogical opportunities in an encounter, in an inquiry, and organize further experiences that might enhance these problems, queries, or ideas that are generated in an encounter to get deeper inside the thinking, to get deeper inside thinking through something. So not necessarily to minimize a problem or to answer a problem, but to enhance a problem and really situate ourselves in it and inhabit the problem, to look at it from multiple angles, and to study it. So here, the teacher has educational desires that are informed by the place and the time that their educational projects are responding to. So here, theoretical perspectives create what an educator pays attention to, what they're listening for, and how they then respond to what it is that they hear and what they notice in an encounter with children and with others. So educators in this post-structural orientation are committed to inventing worlds that thrive in multiplicity and divergence, and they create educational experiences with this goal in mind. Yet they also must be intensely intentional in how they make these decisions, because there's no prescription or step-by-step guide or blueprint that educators can follow in an emergent inquiry, because it unfolds through encounters that are unpredictable. And this is where pedagogical documentation is central in reflecting and planning for emergence. So emergent curriculum requires that educators are deep and critical thinkers, that they don't only rely on policy or procedure to dictate curriculum, but rather curriculum is made actively with children, materials, and others. And educators here must be seen as highly intellectual and able to navigate these very tensioned and irritating gaps between theory and pedagogy, between social and political milieu and ethical decision making about what their pedagogies will respond to and how. And how is a very important part of this. So considering this week's readings, making ethical decisions here is more than about compliance or abiding to a pre-existing framework. This week we'll be looking at the ECEBC Code of Ethics from a feminist post-structural lens, and thinking together about how the principles of this document could be thought of within this particular theoretical orientation. So in your week 7 provocation this week, you'll be reading through the ECEBC Code of Ethics, and you'll be selecting one key principle from this document. So with that, write a 150 to 200 word response that situates this one principle within a feminist post-structural lens, as we've been discussing throughout this course. So if read through this particular lens, what factors might you pay attention to as an educator in ensuring that this principle is enacted? How might you imagine this principle? Is there a quote from this week's readings that might help you better conceptualize this principle? And that's what you're going to be responding to in the forums this week. So also in this week's reading by Marie Batiste, she highlights the colonial nature of education and the ways in which education has been and is a significant component in Canada's ongoing settler colonial project. She writes, quote, "As a cultural manifestation of society, education in North America is hegemonically distributed within raced, classed, and gendered systems," end quote. And we've been discussing this in this course. So in this week's article by Numalo, Vintimilla, and Nelson, the authors trouble some of the taken for granted assumptions about emergent curriculum in early childhood education, and take a critical post-foundational lens to attend to the neoliberal, child-centered, and romanticized ways of understanding emergent curriculum that have become very common in this field, and that under the guise of emergent curriculum and living inquiry, that has been radical in this field to reconceptualize the structures of education, but in recognizing emergent curriculum as a non-neutral and non-innocent process, these authors are highlighting how oftentimes emergent curriculum can actually perpetuate colonial narratives. So I look forward to seeing your thoughts on that article in your virtual collaboratories this week as well. So these authors in this article ask specifically 3 questions. The first one is, how do we respond to what emerges and thereby sustain its conditions in emergent inquiry? For example, what are possibilities for cultivating conditions of emergence amidst the ever-present managerial and custodial structures of early childhood educator subjectivities? A second question that they ask is, in what ways does emergence in curriculum become co-opted toward neoliberal patterns of consumption, and how might this be resisted in curriculum making with young children? And lastly, they ask, what might need to be unsettled about emergence in specific settler, colonial, and anti-Black places and spaces of early childhood education? So these are some very important and provocative questions that I hope that you'll engage with this week. So in your virtual collaboratory groups, you'll be delving deeper into these discussions and thinking through some of these themes together. So in your virtual collaboratory this week, you will be discussing specifically Marie Baptiste's article, Displacing Cognitive Imperialism. And in your notes, I'd like you to specifically include the following points. Include a glossary of 5 words that were puzzling, provocative, or challenging. Include 2 quotes that help you think deeper about colonial legacies in early childhood education. And also include 4 quotes from other readings in the course, particularly maybe this one by Numalo, Vintimilla, and Nelson, because I think there's a lot of overlapping ideas that could be generative for your conversations. So 4 other quotes from other readings, maybe that one in mind, I recommend, to further support, enhance, or complexify Baptiste's arguments as they matter within the field of early childhood education. And then lastly, just include some notes of the group dialogue around these pieces as you've been doing in other virtual collaboratories. Yeah, so I think that's it. If you have any questions, please email me as you have been, which is great. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to reading your responses in the forums this week, and as well as your visual responses. So thanks. Have a great week, everyone.